Hello and welcome to this webinar. This is a Washington, D.C. update on federal government policy as relates to the manufacturing industry. This webinar is brought to you by the National Tooling and Machining Association and the Precision Metal Forming Association. And it is delivered by the D.C. team for both associations. That is the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell, where I work. I'm Caitlin Sickles, and I am joined on the webinar today by my colleague, Paul Nathanson, also from PR Bracewell. Paul and I do the DC Public Affairs and Strategic Communications for NTMA and PMA, of course, together known as One Voice for Manufacturing. That means we do the media work and make sure that the advocacy messages put up by NTMA and PMA are reflected in media. We work closely with the on-the-ground lobbying firm for One Voice, the guys from the Franklin Partnership, who are also, of course, on today's webinar. That's Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik. And they have represented One Voice for a long time here in DC. And we are all looking forward to next week's fly-in when members from NTMA and PMA will gather in DC, have meetings with policymakers, and discuss top issues for One Voice. So today's webinar will be a preview of the topics going on in Washington. We'll hear about the latest from Congress, hear about taxes and regulations, and of course trade and tariffs and supply chain issues. If you want to get a copy of this webinar, you can find it online at onevoiceinfo.org. Onevoiceinfo.org, you can find this webinar, you can find all of the previous webinars that we have put together for several years now. So you can go back into the archives and pull down previous slide decks or recordings if you want to get a copy of the things discussed today. So with that, I am going to turn it over to John from the Franklin Partnership, who will kick us off with the latest of what is going on in Washington. John, over to you.
Well, thanks, Caitlin. Also, anybody wants to ask a question, please type in the questions in the box in the lower right-hand corner. We will try to answer them throughout the presentation, but we will also have time at the end of the presentation to answer any particular questions. As we have been discussing with this group for many weeks and months now, we were hopeful that the R&D tax credit was going to be included. Fixing the R&D tax credit would be included in the year-end package. It was not. And so, as we have mentioned in the past, currently your research and development expenses must be capitalized and amortized over 5 years. The issue, as we've mentioned in the past, Democrats don't want to give the R&D tax credit unless Republicans will reauthorize the advanced child tax credit. The new chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Jason Smith from Missouri, he seems optimistic that there could be a deal in the making for R&D and the child tax credit. One potential deal avenue for, at least for negotiation, is to require some work requirements, so that if a family is going to receive, additional child tax credits, that there would be some specific work requirements. So we'll just say stay tuned. That we're still looking, trying to figure out what is the best vehicle, and one of the potential vehicles out there is the debt ceiling. And so
before you get to that, a couple things on the R&D side, if we could. Just a reminder, quick point of clarification. This is section 174 for R&D expensing. This is separate from section 41, which is the R&D credit. So regardless of whether or not you're claiming the R&D credit, if you don't claim it at all, it doesn't matter. You are still paying taxes on your R&D activities under section 174. So it is completely different. The issue under which the child tax credit is, right now, Republicans have two things, as John mentioned. They want to see maybe some kind of a work requirement or volunteer requirement. But in addition, right now, you were eligible under the expanded version for $3,600 credit for each child under 5 and $3,000 for each credit ages 6 to 17. But you were eligible up to $200,000 per individual, $400,000 per couple. So when you look at it from that wage threshold standpoint, probably something needs to happen on that as well before it goes towards the debt ceiling discussion, if it ends up being that vehicle. So just keep in mind, this is R&D 174, completely separate. I think you're going to be surprised that you see, if you have any R&D activity at all you're going to be very shocked by the exposure to the taxes you've got there. John, jump back in on that.
No, that's very good clarification. And so one potential vehicle to attach a R&D tax credit / child tax credit legislation would be on the debt ceiling. The Congress has reached its spending limit, its credit card limit, and it needs to expand its credit limit. And so the president met with Speaker McCarthy a while back, but no further negotiations or discussions are taking place until Speaker McCarthy and the House Republicans put forward their budget. President Biden put forth his budget a couple weeks ago that Republicans have been very critical of. The administration's cabinet secretaries have been up on Capitol Hill testifying, defending their budget, but to no avail from House Republicans. The House Freedom Caucus, a very conservative Freedom Caucus, has laid out their guidelines of what they wanted as part of the negotiations when Kevin McCarthy became Speaker, with the holdouts who were, holding out, indicating that they would support him. One determination was they wanted the House Republicans to vote on a balanced budget, to vote for a balanced budget. Well, they quickly realized now that they're in control, and with only a slim 5-seat majority, that voting on a balanced budget would be troubling and probably would not have the votes. And so instead of pursuing a balanced budget, their new solution is to limit spending to FY 2022 spending levels. So that is the latest update on balance on the debt ceiling. We continue to expect the Congress to take it up sometime between June and July. The Congressional Budget Office has said that we will hit the hard ceiling sometime between June and September. We think it'll be June, July, maybe beginning of August, because Congress takes their long-awaited August recess, and so we do believe that the Congress will have to address this prior to the recess in August.
I know, John, we usually don't give our political analysis on this one, but maybe we can just here quick for a minute. I know Republicans started with, okay, we're going to balance the budget over 10 years. Then to your point, the others are saying maybe we just stick with FY22 reductions. Do you think they're going to even get that, or where do we end up? Because they're moving the goalposts on themselves. And even when the Senate gets, this is just a House Republican, so they're almost negotiating among themselves right now.
They're negotiating with themselves. And then, I mean, if you go to 2021 levels, that will be a dramatic reduction in defense spending. And I don't think the Republican defense hawks, even Democrat defense hawks out there, would support that kind of reduction, that sort of reduction in defense spending. So I don't see them. I mean, they will try to achieve that 2022 spending levels, but I don't think they'll get there.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. We're not going to run through these charts, just giving you more examples of the latest that we're seeing with regards to the GDP and the debt. But let's just jump right into some of the regulatory issues here and keeping us on schedule. OSHA, as we've talked about in the past, is working on a rule about indoor and outdoor workplace regulations and safety when the heat index reaches 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, the heat index reaches 80 degrees Fahrenheit. There's a chance that OSHA is going to put forward a rule that will include requirements such as personal protective equipment, engineering administrative controls, prescribed water and rest breaks, a certain amount of water you must have depending on the temperature outside. This could certainly have a significant impact on many of our members across the country, ranging from the older 100-year-old buildings in the New England area down to those that are down south as well in the summertime months, and make major disruptions to productivity. This is a public hearing that is coming up. It's a listen-only hearing. John and I have participated and weighed in now with 3 different hearings over the last 9 months where we have been able to put our voice and our comments forward, but this one's also open to the public if anyone wants to jump in on it. April 27th from 2 to 4, you'll get some more insight into what OSHA is planning. Again, reminder, there were 8 attorneys general from around the country, Democrats, that were pushing for OSHA to move forward with this heat rule, indoor heat rule, outdoor, to come out by the summertime, which they're not, but they're still on path to release something that's out there. John, we know the non-compete is something that's been getting a lot of attention, particularly from House Republicans in the chamber and others too.
Yeah, the Federal Trade Commission is looking at a proposed rule that would ban non-compete clauses in employment contracts. And we have joined a very large coalition of other trade associations who are expressing concern about not only about the FTC's authority to issue a rule banning non-competes, but also the concerns about the non-competes itself. The initial letter that went to the administration that we co-signed with the coalition asked for the comment period to be extended. And so we just did find out in the past month that they did agree to extend the comment period till April 19th. And so I know the coalition is working on submitting comments on that. Looking at the National Labor Relations Board, the General Counsel of the National Labor Relations Board sent a memo to all the NLRB offices around the country, basically expressing concern and frowning upon severance agreements that basically waive the rights to employees. And they are particularly frowning on severance agreements which has some non-disclosure or non-disparaging comments on it. And so they are going back to the original interpretation of severance agreements going back from previous administrations, and so they're frowning upon that.
Just another reminder, we've said this before, employee retention tax credit. It's a warning out there from the IRS. This is now their second warning, and I think since Christmas time. And this is regarding the ERTC, as we refer to it, that we helped create during the COVID highlight days. What this is, the warning is, there's a lot of shops out there that are going in and they're claiming that they can, for employers, get you your refund expedited, or are encouraging, if you haven't already, to apply for the employee retention credit. And they typically take commissions. Those that are on the more legit side, I've heard, are taking about 15 cents on the dollar that you're able to get back, so about a 15% commission. But some of these others are asking much, much higher, and they're not delivering, especially if they're asking for upfront. So be careful on this one. Make sure you're using a legitimate CPA firm, especially when it comes to dealing with the IRS. They're seeing a lot of fraud and abuse. You do not want to get caught up in that one as well. A few things here. We just want to update you on the latest with regards to the CHIPS semiconductor law that the president signed August 9th of last year. They are continuing to roll out the different provisions in there. We had long been telling you that in late spring, early summer, early March rather, late winter, early spring, we were going to get from the Commerce Department more information on grant opportunities. We are now starting to see those funding notices that are coming out, in addition to the investment credits from the IRS that are coming out as well. They are a little bit narrow in terms of qualifying as the qualified property that would be eligible for the 25% credit, which must be integral to the operation of advanced manufacturing facility. And you can go into what they mean by integral. There are actual definitions when you go through both this proposed regulation and then also the broader language that they've got with regards to the grants that are out there. So you can see that semiconductor manufacturing equipment means the specialized equipment integral to the manufacturing of semiconductors and subsystems that enable or are incorporated into the manufacturing equipment. And they look at different examples in there, the type of equipment that would be eligible under their interpretation, and a few others, as well as they take a look at that the property that deals with and is essential to the completeness of the manufacturing operation as well when it specifies. So this is still open for comment with regards to the definition of integral for the semiconductor or semiconductor manufacturing equipment. We know we'll talk to some of the folks over at AMT here in the next few weeks when we see them and touch base and get their interpretation. We actually reached out to them a number of months ago as well. And here's what there's some of the definition from the IRS on guidance, their guidance rather, on semiconductors. Advanced packaging means a subset of packaging technologies, and including embedded die, system and packaging equipment, 3D stacking, others on the chip side. So we are starting to see this roll out. In addition, this is on the tax credit. So this is from what was included on the tax incentive side. In addition, they also put out the funding. So these are the hard dollars that they are now making available. Multiple billions of dollars that are starting to flow out the door. National Institute of Standards and Technologies is what NIST stands for, part of the Department of Commerce. And you can start seeing the announcement that was recently posted with some upcoming pre-application and then final application deadlines coming up here. From our understanding, as you take a look at the key dates on this slide, they are looking to do rollouts on, they're going to do the awarding on a rolling basis. There's not going to be a hard deadline where they say, okay, you must get all the applications in by this day. We'll make an announcement by Y day. They want to take a look at programs that are ready to go, and then those that might need a little bit more planning, which is why they're looking at the pre-application process, where you can forward an inquiry to the department and they'll give you feedback on what changes they might make, recommendations. Or there's so many of our companies are obviously not running commercial fabrication facilities, but many of you are supplying some of your customers who are. And so we want to take a look at ways where you could benefit from, and anybody that your customers, and you can all kind of rise together. It's the hope there. And then lastly, before we jump into some of the trade issues, and John, jump in here on some of the color commentary where Biden's feeling stuck between the Hill and the Europeans, and he's trying to please everybody. But the G7 nations in May, they're going to get together in Indonesia for a number of trade agreements are going to come together there, by the way. But this big one is also Biden's creating a bunch of non-free trade agreements that he wants to partner. You know, we don't have an agreement right now with the European Union, but they want to make it so that the Europeans can ship chips and rare earth elements and minerals and components for batteries into the U.S. without being subject to tariffs, and also eligible for some of the tax credits there. So the G7 is working on finalizing this deal, but John, I know it's causing some heartburn, particularly with Manchin and others.
Yeah, as we've mentioned in the past, to take advantage of the electric vehicle credit that you had mentioned, is that the critical minerals must be procured in the United States. And so the head of the EU met with the president recently to start negotiations to allow critical minerals that are procured in the EU. Those minerals, that were created made into those batteries, would be eligible for the credit. Now that is causing pushback by those in Congress, you know, those who believe very strongly that it only if you're going to take advantage of a credit, it only should be, you know, American-made critical minerals. And so that is what the debate is taking place right now in Washington. And so there is pushback from the right and the left on this. And so we'll see how this G7, in the end, I think they're going to have to come to some sort of agreement, because I just don't think we are at a point in this country in the mining and the development that we have enough critical minerals out there to supply the demand for the electric vehicle batteries.
Yeah, it's a very legitimate point. Why are we allowing the Europeans to come in here? And in many ways, you should go back to the China hearing from the House committee. The perception of many on Capitol Hill, many if not almost all, is that we are in a technological warfare already with China. And moving forward, it is not going to be the Cold War like the 1970s, where the shelves are barren and empty in the Soviet Union. This is a different kind of hot Cold War moving forward with regards to technology. So I think they're trying to look at it in a way where they can create an us versus them and bring in as much of the West together against. So they now have a definition of those foreign countries that are non-allied, that are antagonistic to the United States. They are Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and Cuba, and Venezuela, I think, is also on it. There were 5 really listed, 5 or 6. So those are the ones that they're identifying and moving forward and looking at really creating and restrictions. And that's in large part because you take a look at the Made in China 2025, the different priorities that they've gone through with regards to where they want to take their technology and try to get more advanced in the United States, and they're in the process of doing so. This is a slide we just put up here because there's something called the Congressional Research Service. This is a nonpartisan body that literally is the researchers for Congress. And so we thought it would be interesting just to put up what their analysis is, because there's a lot of language that is coming up from Congress and legislation as well with regards to China and how to address it. So you'll see the CRS report here talks about the People's Republic of China, states' growing role in businesses, calls for treating them differently than what we would call more commercially and capitalist-oriented companies as well, the future trajectory of the US PRC technology ties, and they need more, they're calling for more action on that. So I thought it was an interesting read for those of us that are following this closely, because the Court of International Trade up in New York recently sided with the Biden/Trump administration, saying that despite the way that Trump went about putting in tariffs on China on lists 3 and 4, that the court said that USTR did have the authority to in fact apply those tariffs as a modification without initiating a brand new list. So this is that court decision that was decided on St. Patrick's Day last week that upheld the Biden administration's effort on there. But I don't know, Paul, if you want to take this one on Russia and the 200% tariff on aluminum, because as we mentioned, you've now, I don't want to call it the axis of evil, but you definitely have this group that the Biden administration is trying to put on one side and the rest of the world on another.
Yeah, I think we talked, well, we didn't talk, we've talked about this in the past on our weekly calls, but since our last webinar, I think nobody's surprised, because the Biden administration had been signaling this for weeks, if not months, that they put a 200% tariff on on imports of Russian aluminum. You can see the details from the declaration there. There was options going all the way to just a total ban, but they opted for a tariff, which will tighten the aluminum market a bit more. Obviously, there isn't a lot of pushback on this given where this aluminum is coming from, but this is more towards where the administration wants to go on aluminum and steel anyway, which is to create this club of good imports and bad imports based on carbon and other factors.
But it's also punishing Ukraine, right, Paul? Russia's involvement in Ukraine.
Well, the whole purpose of the tariff is additional. It was announced on the end. Thank you, John. It was announced on the anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, and so it was an additional sanction, or additional consequence. That's how it was termed. Yes, John. So the purpose of the tariff is to further punish Russia. Go ahead.
Sorry, Paul, there's also a China angle here, as if you were looking at it in the context of on the left side of the screen that we've highlighted in red for you, those of you that are on the phone, it says, or the aluminum articles are cast in Russia, and derivative aluminum articles where any amount of primary aluminum used in the manufacture of the derivative aluminum articles is smelted in Russia, or the derivative aluminum articles are cast in Russia. So now what this means, if the Chinese are in fact trying to create more of an economic alliance with the Russians, if the Chinese are now shipping into the United States any components, any parts that you all compete with made of Russian aluminum or Russian castings or Russian parts, that would be subject to a 200% tariff starting on April 10th. So that is another layer to think about this in the broader context, and it's in addition to Russia and Ukraine and those areas as well. Paul, the other area that we did get some issue and notice on is the long-awaited U.S. International Trade Commission report, where a number of us testified at in July of last year.
Yes, both the PMA and NTMA and Omar and myself testified at a hearing. If you may recall, in the summer, the Congress had told the U.S. ITC, the International Trade Commission, to undertake a study on the economic impact of the Section 232 and 301 tariffs on U.S. industries. We're still going through the report, but I don't think there's many surprises that while the report found a negative impact on consumers of steel and aluminum in the United States, and I guess a somewhat positive impact for the steel industry, a lot of the data, we think is probably downplays the full impact from what we know, from what we've heard from all of you over the last 5 years. I mean, it said that the Section 232 tariffs reduced imports of steel products by 24% and increased the price of steel products in the U.S. by 2.4%, and increased U.S. production of steel products by 1.9%. It said that that U.S. production of steel, so it helped the steel producers by 1.3 billion, because it said U.S. production of steel was $1.3 billion higher in 2021 due to Section 232 tariffs. But it also said that it cost downstream users 3.4 billion. I mean, we're still going through it, and there are good nuggets that we're going to pick out of it, but it really, from our estimate, really downplayed the negative impact. One point that the report says, it's not an assessment of complete economy-wide impacts of the tariffs under Section 232 and 301. and it only looks at this period. It is not forward-looking, so there's a lot of caveats, but I do think there are some things that we can build on. It clearly shows the negative impact and the limited benefit of these tariffs on the economy. So it does call into question again why these tariffs are continuing. And I'm only talking about the 232s on the side of this study.
Yeah, and you know, it's important as you look at this slide, because we'll move on from it here, but stainless in the bottom left is the green. So you look at, remember we had those conversations in the summer of 21 about all the problems and continuing with stainless steel. You look at it was among the most tariffed items coming in on the steel side as well. And then you take a look at the wrought aluminum in addition to that, and the derivatives articles of aluminum that were subject to tariffs. There's quite a bit that were out there in terms of being subject, and obviously, yeah, that's why, again, analysis, I'm not sure I entirely agree with the ITC's 1-for-1, where they say the price of the aluminum steel tariff was 25% and prices went up 24%. That's just not what we saw, although, you know, it's all subjective. And to Paul, your point, there's some additional numbers here where they're claiming on some of our industries, fabricated metal, for example, you've got some of our other shops in here, industrial machine, a lot of NTMA members will fall into 333s. Numbers there, a lot of PMAs will be 332. You got machine shops that will be in there as well. They're saying it's really only a change about 1 or 2% in some of these industries, whereas we saw pretty significant from what we've been told from some of our other shops that are out there. At least that's what we were being told. Paul, you mentioned it wasn't that part. Those comments there were on the 232 side, but the report also did go over the section 301, which are the tariffs on Chinese imports of 25% and 7.5% that are out there. Keep those in mind. There's some numbers in here. Again, you can just take a look at your own time here, just trying to study the impact that the tariffs had on domestic imports. And they did, as I turn it over to John, we'll get into some what we're seeing in supply chains. But the report did tell us what we already knew, that it was not China that paid the tariffs, but it was the importers and the ultimate users of those goods in the US. John, the beige book, it's one of the things that people like me geek out on, and the federal bank reports that come out, we are seeing some normalization here.
Yeah, and no surprise to anybody who's listening to this webinar who is in business right now. You know, the Census Bureau, you know, came out with their survey saying, hey, manufacturing is starting to slow. Now, I know many PMA and NTMA members are running and gunning right now, but predictions are, you know, for the third and fourth quarter of this year that we do believe there's going to be a slowdown in production. We're seeing that in our surveys moving forward. To Omar's point, the beige book, the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland and Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, they make, you know, statements, observations now and then that are critical. And again, not a surprise to anybody here that they're saying, you know, demand, you know, is ticking up if you're in aerospace, agriculture, or in heavy trucks. But if you're in an industry that is tied to interest rates like real estate or light vehicles, you're seeing a downturn, a slight downturn in the economy. And here's from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago saying manufacturing backlog is decreasing. And so it is down a little bit, but it has remained strong due to that backlog. And again, auto production is up slightly, but it's limited to the availability of semiconductor chips and the availability of the labor force.
Yeah, for those of you that aren't familiar with the beige books, we get ready to hand it over to Caitlin and close us out here in a second. The Federal Reserve banks, they're all over the country. You've got San Francisco, Cleveland, Chicago, Boston, New York, obviously, others. The St. Louis Fed is very good on agribusiness. Dallas isn't bad, has some good data, especially for your oil and gas sector folks. What they do is they interview manufacturers, retailers, insurance, other leaders in the community, such as yourselves. We've had some folks in the past that have been interviewed, and to get a better sense of the flavor of what's going on out there in America. They put it out, the last one before this March one you're looking at came out in January. So they're pretty brisk read, and it'll help give your sales team, give yourselves, your procurement folks, just a little general pulse of what others are saying out there in terms of their reporting that's out. But Caitlin, there's no shortage of ways to find us.
That is right. If you want to hear more information like what we've discussed on the webinar today, you can look up the podcast. So we have a podcast, Talking with One Voice. You can get it wherever you get your podcast. So Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, wherever you like to find podcasts, you can find it there. If you subscribe to the show, it will be automatically put into your feed, so it will be easier for you to find other episodes. If you are a listener of the show, we appreciate it. So give us a rate or review of the show, which helps other listeners find it. Again, if you are looking for content from today's webinar, check out the One Voice Info website. That will give you this content, as well as a number of other resources that are helpful.
Absolutely, as always, welcome your support. We've got a lot going on, as you can see, in Washington, D.C., and so your donations to the advocacy programs for NTMA and PMA make this webinar and our activities here in Washington possible. You can see your link right there. It could be a corporate donation. If you got your credit card handy, please do so. As we get ready to wrap up, please enter any questions, as John mentioned, on the right-hand side. We'd happy to answer any questions that we've got in there. We've got a couple of things that we've got right now, and questions that we've got come in. One of them was good for the general, go to the order here, on the second PPP loans and Paycheck Protection Loan forgiveness in general. What are the timelines looking on that? We are going to start with the Employee Retention Tax Credit. We are starting to see a little bit of softening in terms of the lead time that's there. What we are trying to get a better sense of is on the ERTC, if they are starting to release some of those refunds a little bit more quickly. Our recent indications has gotten a little bit better since the December timeframe. In terms of the PPP loans themselves as well, if you're on your second PPP loan, our understanding is if it's over a certain dollar amount, typically they use 2 million as the threshold. What they're going to be doing is then they'll probably go through a secondary audit system. There's a lot of inquiries coming from Capitol Hill right now with regards to COVID spending and unspent funds as well. And you're going to see that level of scrutiny increase, particularly among House Republicans of the Biden administration, which is why it's taking a little bit longer for the IRS, Treasury, SBA to process some of these things as they're starting to dig a little bit deeper, and some of our fraud comments that were out there as well. We've got a couple other questions that have come in here. We're happy to continue to take them. Yes, this presentation is being recorded, and the full copy of the slide deck and the recording usually goes out somewhere around 2 o'clock Eastern this afternoon. So you should be receiving that within the next several hours, and that will be out there. Another question that we received is with regards to the research and development credit itself. Is it still in effect for 2022 and 2023? The answer is yes. Section 41, IRC 41 is still in effect. You can and should still be claiming the R&D credit, because you can use that credit to offset the capitalization and the taxation as an asset. So it does actually reduce your tax liability. Your CPA will factor that in automatically into your R&D liability. Most of you should have been notified of what that liability is in recent weeks. But yeah, absolutely, you should still be claiming the R&D, because you're going to need that offset as much as you can. Another comment and question that we received is that the U.S. government has, with regards to unfair trade practices from foreign companies, given how much they're subsidized by their governments, particularly by China. That's my addition. I believe that the U.S. government has two choices: support us as much as China or Canada supports their mold makers and manufacturers, or maintain tariffs. And from there, what aspects of focused on the tariffs? A couple of things are happening with the conversations there. We do not believe that the Biden administration is going to lift the tariffs on China. In fact, it is and has been the position of One Voice is that we need to maintain tight controls on what comes in on China, particularly if we have a chance to combat their intellectual property theft and forced technology transfer and their subsidies, which the 301s, frankly, have not been successful in doing, but at least it helps a little bit. So we do believe that the Biden administration will keep some type of tariffs in place on China, at least at the 25% level, and then probably some kind of a carbon tariff down the line as well. The U.S. Congress is also looking at some kind of a carbon tariff. The U.S. is not going to get to the level of subsidization that the Chinese government does for a number of reasons. One, you don't want them to. Those are called state-owned enterprises, and they'll take over your business. And the banks are run by the state in many ways. But from the Canadian standpoint, a lot of the subsidies there come from energy and hydro and what they're able to do in those spaces. The U.S. is now starting to impose their own subsidies and tax incentives, and that's starting to roil some of the Europeans that are out there. But on the Chinese tariffs, we fully expect them to remain in place and are being vocal with the administration on what China continues to do on subsidization.
Hey, Omar, and I mean, I agree with the Congressional Research Service analysis that we had on an earlier slide that, with that China 2025 manufacturing policy, I mean, there's little incentive for the administration to lift those tariffs on China.
There are, we were trading emails with Livia at the White House. She's a former Bob Casey staffer, senator from Pennsylvania. She's now director of the Made in America office at the White House. And they've got a number of resources between them and the Department of Commerce where we can submit anonymous reporting if we are seeing anything about tariff evasion, any type of manipulation of the tariff rates and getting around. So that would be helpful if we can always provide those as well. So we're happy to provide any other information. I think we got one more question. I know we've gone a little bit over. Question is, do we help in identifying grant options for NTMA and PMA members? And if so, where can we find those? The answer is yes, with regards to workforce training and incentives that are put out by the federal government, regions, and states. Our firm, Franklin Partnership, does put out a matrix to both NTMA and PMA, usually around mid-month, every month. And that has tabs and locations that each group puts out by state, and you can identify your location and what grant opportunities there might be there. We don't fill out grants, but we certainly do help try to bring some of your money back. Any other questions? I know we're a little long at 12:36 Eastern. Any other questions? Thank you. Not seeing any others come in. Our next webinar will be on Friday, May 5th. That is a week after the NTMA conference. So please join us then. Any questions between now and then? You see our contact information on the slide, and hope you enjoy your weekend. Please let us know if you need anything. Thank you.
Thank you.